there's 3 ways to grow a muscle. Myofibril hypertrophy.
And what
we
does
call
that mean?
muscle protein synthesis. It means the growth of the actual structure of the cell. Actin and myosin coming together to make a thicker cell. And, the actin and myosin, they're kind of like this, and they come together. So and there's no halfway. It's like, you have, the actin and myosin, they're either open or they're closed. And the shorter a muscle becomes, then the more of those things are engaged. So by creating more of those, that's myofibril hypertrophy. I think, and this is I hate calling it a problem with research because it probably have sports science people like really mad at me, and they should be mad at me. So I'm saying this with caution. Volume training really doesn't do much of that.
And when you say volume training, is that training to build your muscle?
Not right. So everything X3 was up until recently was focused on strength. So we were focused on that type of growth, myofibril hypertrophy, the density of a cell, the performance of a cell. So if you're a gymnast, you really want to focus on myofibril hypertrophy. You really don't want sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Because if you focus on myofibril, you have a high power to weight ratio. You are very powerful, not necessarily heavy. No unnecessary weight. So sprinters, gymnasts, that's what they are training for. Now, I should say, most types of resistance exercise are getting some of each of these things. So, like for example, strength training, when you're really training for strength, going to failure or even beyond failure, like with X3, so you might have like -2 reps in reserve sort of thing, because you really worked the diminishing range, which, remember, you've done diminishing range sets before. You're really just working the stretch position in diminishing range. Yeah, I mean, it's like extra work for that stretch position. That may be part of the reason that we get so much blood flow into the muscle and start to build some of the other type of muscular growth, which is sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So think of myofibril hypertrophy as the engine. Think of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy as the gas tank. So with sarcoplasmic, you want to get as much blood flowing into the muscle as possible so that the central nervous system decides, you know what, all that fuel we need for contraction, the ATP, the glycogen, and the creatine phosphate, we're going to store more of that here. And by storing more of it here, it makes the muscle bigger. So when somebody says their training is really focused on hypertrophy, basically all the stuff I ignored up until recently, that's what that is. So when somebody's doing, 5 or 6 sets and they're doing like 5 reps in reserve, like, so let's say they're using the X3 and they're doing a chest press where normally their all-out failure set is 20 repetitions with the black band on the chest press. Well, instead, if they're trying to make the muscle larger, they might do that on, the beginning of their workout. And then they do 5 more sets, but only do 15 repetitions. So 5 reps in reserve, right? So, and you stop short of failure so that you're really just compounding that blood flow into the cell, leaving that ATP, glycogen, and creatine phosphate behind. Really just glycogen, and then, based on the GLUT4 function, it splits off into these other fuels that are ready at different stages. The glycogen is, ATP is the most ready, then glycogen, then creatine phosphate. So the compounding of those fuels, so this is volume training. The bodybuilders are really heavy into the sarcoplasmic effect. So when you see guys who are clearly not training to fatigue and they're doing just set after set after set, that's what they're doing. And so, like, a lot of times I'd show, and I was totally ignorant to how bodybuilding worked or the approaches or anything like that. So I'd show these guys X3 and I'd go to absolute failure and they go, do you have to do it like that? Or, can you just do it, until you just get a pump, and I'm looking at him like, why would you want to do that? Well, now I know because I've read hypertrophy research. Like I said,
how long ago have you read that research, just out of interest?
the last 6 months.
Oh, okay.
Like I ignored it like my whole
Because last
life.
time we kind of didn't talk about this, and I think you've made an interesting distinction, particularly even the people that are referencing some of your stuff. Because I guess, I've almost changed some of the questions I was going to ask, because it sounds like it's dependent on, well, what are you training for? Are you training for pure strength? Are you training because you want to build muscle, or do you kind of want a little bit of both?
Yeah, and sometimes somebody will say, well, I'm a rugby player. Well, are you a prop? Are you a lock? Or are you a wing? Because I'm going to have a different training. Like a wing needs to focus on strength only, like myofibril growth. The standard X3 program is for them. If you're a prop, yeah, you're better being bigger. So I mean, that's a heavy guy position. You still need to be able to move pretty quick, but being 160 pounds, you're not going to be a very good prop. So you want to volumize some of that tissue. Plus, it gives the muscle endurance. So like sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, I wouldn't, it's not really strength training. And when you say volume training, what the hell does volume mean? Does it mean just the size of the muscle, or does it mean you do a lot of it? Actually, both. And neither of those two things necessarily matter, because what the actual effect is you can go from contracting against a weight, 12 repetitions, then to 15 repetitions, then to 17 repetitions, and then you can change the weight and your repetitions get lower. But it's a different type of strength. It is an ability to sustain consistent contractions.
Like if you're a mixed martial artist, for example, you'd probably want that first type of strength as opposed to the second.
That's right. You don't want to carry around any extra weight. You don't want your blood pumping to a larger muscle. You want your blood pumping to a smaller, more powerful muscle. So like MMA guys, they're not doing volume training at all. They're doing X3 as standard. And coincidentally, like Forrest Griffin wrote the foreword of my book. Like the UFC guys really understood X3. They're like, wow, I can deliver a lot more power in my in my fighting by using this. Whereas then the bodybuilders are just like confused, like, why do you only do one set? And why does it look like your head's going to pop when you do that one set? And it's like, well, because I'm trying to stimulate the maximum amount of strength. And they're sort of like, wow, this guy really doesn't know bodybuilding. Yeah, you're right. I don't. But I figured it out. And so you can use it sort of in two different ways. And when it comes, so now let me talk about the third type of muscle growth. And that's called hyperplasia. Now, that's the hardest kind to get. And it really has to do with a combination of stimulating the muscle, having a lot of blood flow, and then stretching after that. So,
and why would you, just before you go on to that, why and who would be interested in that, just to kind of help understand that?
It would be an amplification of the first ability, being myofibril. So, but that splits muscle cells. So whenever they do a cadaver examination on somebody who is like a bodybuilder or a power lifter, and then they count the number of cells, and they're like, oh, this guy was clearly born to be a strong guy, because he has like 5 times the amount of muscle cells that the average person has. And for a long time, the idea was you only have hyperplasia in the womb. Like after you're born, that's just the number of cells you have, that's the number you're going to die with. So turns out that's not true, because you can force them to split.
When do we know that?
When
did we find out about that? Is it a recent thing, or?
I think the first, it was theorized about in the 80s. I think Professor Jose Antonio out of Florida State, he's probably like the top protein researcher like on earth. He did his PhD dissertation in the stretching of muscular, stretch-mediated hypertrophy is what it's called now. So you can also have a muscle grow just by stretching it, no strength training at all. However, you got to stretch it for hours on end, and it is a 9 out of 10 pain that you have to go through. So much harder to get a muscle to grow. So I kind of took all this information. I just sort of split the difference and thought, okay, what are people going to do? And coincidentally, there was a program out there from, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. There was a guy named Dante who came out with a training program, and he calls it DC training or dog crap training. So he sort of made the name of his training program an insult to the training program to sort of get out in front of the trolls. So it was like, which was actually kind of brilliant, because you talk to just about any strength athlete or bodybuilder and they're like, oh, I totally read that. I remember like 15 years ago. And so what he would advocate for was what I saw as the best way to leverage everything. So first, you get blood flow into the muscle. You get a pump. So you're stretching the casing of the muscle. Also, this was also called bag theory. So as in the bag of the muscle, the fascia of the muscle, that's one of the limitations to growth because it's very tight on the cells. If you can expand it slightly, it gives the muscle more room to grow. So how do you expand it? It's a combination of getting blood flow, the maximum amount of blood flow, so biggest pump you can have, and then after you're done exercising the target muscle, then you stretch the hell out of it. 9 out of 10 pain, maybe hold it for a minute, maybe 30 seconds. I said 30 seconds in the book. And so that's what I call the hyperplasia protocol. And so that's just added growth on top of the other two types of growth, depending on how you're training.
And that doesn't, the bit that we talked about earlier, which is then stretching at the bottom of the muscle, those are two separate things, because what you're saying then is when let's say you're doing a chest press again, what you really want to be doing is you want to be stimulating the muscle through the whole range, particularly at the top where you're the strongest. The bottom.
You want to make sure you go full range. So I think initially these studies came out to keep people from thinking of doing strong range partials. So what they don't want to do is every once in a while you see somebody put 2,000 pounds on the leg press, and then they unrack it and they bring it back an inch, and then you know they do like really short repetitions.
Like,
right. So those aren't nearly as productive as going the full range. I mean, I don't think anybody was really surprised by that, but it's great to know that. So you got to go full range, but there's no real magic in the stretch portion other than by going full range, you get the maximum amount of blood flow, which is going to put the maximum amount of pressure on the casing of the muscle. If you stretch then afterward, because stretching a muscle, like pressure internally, pushing externally from any direction is going to make more room. So by blood volume, let's say a muscle's from here to here, and the muscle's in between. So imagine it looks like a football, because that's so they kind of taper off at the ends, where they insert the origin versus the insertion. You can have internal pressure with the blood flow. Then by pulling it apart, you're intensifying what's going on the inside and making that pressure even greater.
And does that not, that your story about your body protects itself by making sure it doesn't overstretch, is that only if the muscle recognizes there being load on there, as opposed to it just kind of actually stretching out then, do you think?
Oh, you're definitely shutting muscle cells off by doing that, but the workout's over. So it doesn't matter. You're doing it just to create pressure on the fascia.
Okay.
So that you're making more, basically just making more room for growth to happen.